All right, looks like we're live.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Peer to Peer Policy Pod. I am Brian Morgenstern here with Sam Lyman. Much to discuss. Kamala replicating the basement strategy of Biden, as well as potentially his anti-crypto, anti-Bitcoin agenda. Uh, Ted Cruz coming out talking about his own Bitcoin mining experience. President Trump going live back on Twitter, both with tweets and a long interview or discussion with Elon Musk. Lots to dig into today. Some power news in Texas, which really everybody across the country, but especially there's a ton to talk about today. So Sam, where should we get started?
Yeah, let's begin with the basement strategy that you mentioned. So, what is the basement strategy? Let's take everyone back to 2020. In 2020, as many might recall, there was a global pandemic, COVID, and the Biden campaign made ample use of COVID to enact a new campaign strategy where essentially they kept President Joe Biden in the basement for several months during the height of campaign season. And they did it under the pretext of COVID protocols. So that worked back in 2020 pretty effectively because the Biden campaign could lean on a heavily sympathetic media to do the heavy lifting for them. They could lean on the media to attack Trump 24/7 while simultaneously downplaying the greatest weaknesses of the Biden campaign. So now it's 2024. We now no longer have an aging septuagenarian running for president, and there's no more COVID, yet we're still seeing the same play from the playbook, the basement strategy. We now have Kamala Harris, who has been put in a metaphorical bunker. She's done no interviews. She's answered all of 5 questions from press since she started her campaign. And mum is the word on the Kamala campaign trail. And so it's the basement strategy all over again. And it's having a great effect, at least according to some polls. Dylan, do you mind pulling up the first story here? So, as the mainstream media has astroturfed this support for Kamala Harris, we're hearing news of a blue wall that's forming in some swing states. And then, can you go to the next pop up as well? We simultaneously have gushing profiles of Kamala Harris, such as this Time magazine cover, her moment. It's a puff piece all about the new Democratic contender for president. What's most ironic about this puff piece is that Time magazine reached out to the Kamala campaign asking for comment, and what they heard back was Kamala will not be available for this interview. Thank you for the request, though. So they won't even answer questions to puff piece journalists who want to sing the praises of their candidate. So it's a crazy situation where we now have on Polymarket, we see that the odds for Kamala winning the presidency are 52% to Trump's 45%, a pretty big swing there. Brian, what do you make of all this? What do you make of the current state of the Kamala Harris campaign and where things might go from here?
It is such an interesting thing to see uh, what was leading into this campaign, the least popular vice president in modern history. She was completely underwater with her unfavorables. The most common thing people thought about when it came to Kamala Harris was her rambling and bizarre answers to questions, her very strange quotes that she used in speeches over and over again about the significance of the passage of time, or about what has been or what can be unburdened by what has been. Just sort of these meaningless platitudes. And then you give it a few weeks, and the media has really done quite a job of remaking her. And put it all in context, right? This was after the debate. President Biden, his support cratered because he was so clearly not up to the job. He then drops out because of that. And because he was not going to get reelected because people saw with their own eyes that he's not up to the job. And now all of a sudden he's George Washington. He's a hero and he's the greatest president ever, even though everybody knows he's not up to the job. And then, like I said, Harris was historically unpopular. And now all of a sudden she's the second coming and the greatest thing since sliced bread. So quite a narrative that has been created. And I will say, to the credit of the Harris campaign, they know she's not very good at interviews. They know she rambles. They know she makes bizarre statements. She with her another factor, the baby talk when she says things like "I love school buses," just a bunch of like random statements. So if that were my candidate, I'd probably advise her to let the media do the heavy lifting for us as well. And they're employing that to great effect. I think, if I were advising the Trump campaign, I would encourage them to spend as much money as possible on ads reminding people of what they thought of Kamala Harris before this media onslaught. What's really troubling is there's still no policy prescriptions. Now, we understand she may give a policy speech soon, perhaps, maybe putting some meat on the bone, fleshing out some issues. But that'll be particularly interesting because it's almost like she's running away from or against the Biden-Harris administration's record on some of the key issues of this campaign, including their policies that caused inflation, including their open border policies, both of which are terrifically unpopular. With respect to Bitcoin and the broader crypto industry, the administration has been extraordinarily hostile. And while she's remained silent, we have some leading Democrats coming out trying to tamp down, the industry's opposition to her, saying, "Oh no, no, she'll be different. She'll be different." Of course, we have no real reason to believe that at this point. So it's this contrived reality that is shockingly effective at changing the tide in the polls. At least what the numbers are saying. Now, whether you trust polls or not, I think is always a good question. There's a couple of good polls out there. There's a lot of bad polls out there. But this is a really interesting transformation. I think voters are going to have to be especially discerning in this election because of what we'll talk about, I think, shortly, which is, the mainstream media's refusal to report facts and commitment to narrative. So we'll see where it goes, but this is quite the transformation we've seen in just a matter of a couple of weeks.
Yeah, Brian, you hit the nail on the head there. The media, I think, is so culpable for this distorted view of Kamala Harris and who she really is. They've essentially been running interference for her since she announced her campaign. And it's a really bad sign that if your campaign strategy is keeping your candidate quiet, I think that's really strong evidence that you don't have a strong candidate for office. Nevertheless, the media is digging deep and they're sticking with this strategy of really trying to guard Kamala Harris from any skepticism or any criticism whatsoever. They seem to be leveraging what little credibility they have left in being more or less the propaganda arm of the Democratic Party at this point. And I think the American people are starting to take notice. We actually have some Gallup data. This is from a year ago, so good probability that it's even worse now. But recent Gallup data shows that trust in the media has reached historic lows. It's dipped down to about 32% of Americans who actually trust the mainstream media these days. My question, Brian, is if Kamala Harris wins this election, if the media can actually get her across the finish line, do you think this is the last gasp of a dying media institution, or do you think they can keep this going for another decade?
I think the landscape is changing daily. I mean, and it's becoming more decentralized, to use the term in the Bitcoin lexicon. Those numbers that you showed, I mean, I'm surprised it's that high at this point. But for example, if you're looking at 32% approval rating, if a president for that territory, I think Joe Biden was not that far off. I think after the debate, there's an old joke from John McCain and others. When you see approval ratings going that low, you're down to blood relatives and paid staffers in the approval pool. So, but there's an interesting thing because still, as we sit here today, most Americans are still consuming a lot of mainstream media. The nightly news on the major networks still gets very good ratings. The subscribership to the New York Times, Washington Post, and others is still, in the many millions. And that brings to mind something that, we've heard some of the sort of techno optimist entrepreneurs talk about recently, like Bill Ackman and others, who have pointed out that, maybe you're somebody who's diligent, you get up, you read a lot of the news every day, and then you stumble upon a topic that you know a lot about, that you actually deal with on a regular basis, and you read the coverage and you think they're so uninformed, this is so wrong. But then you go and read other articles that you don't know that much about in terms of the subject matter, and you don't know what you don't know. And so you also consume that information. And I will scream this from the rafters. It's garbage in, garbage out. You need to be consuming the best information. And unfortunately, the mainstream media is not giving that to the American people. And if you have an uninformed electorate, you're not going to have well-informed policy decisions. You're not going to have politicians forming lasting coalitions. It's going to be based on these kind of fleeting vibes. I think more and more people are waking up to that. And like I said, the media landscape is changing quite rapidly. And I think, evidence of that would be what Elon Musk was touting after his conversation with Donald Trump, that it had a billion impressions. Obviously, that's far more than what your typical mainstream media outlet is going to be getting. So people are seeking alternative media. They're seeking out information to make themselves better informed, so that they're not making decisions about their daily lives, their professions, their investments, everything else, based on just kind of the mainstream media vibes. So to your very precise and good question, I don't know the answer as to whether the mainstream media is going to be just obliterated tomorrow, or if there's going to be a change of business model, or if things are going to continue to evolve over the course of a decade. But I will say, just zooming in, to the trees as opposed to the forest, it does appear that people are seeking out more and better information, and that is a good thing. That's healthy for democracy.
Yeah, Brian, you hit on such an interesting parallel there, where we're seeing the dismantling of legacy media as people seek out alternative sources for news and information. And that tracks really closely with the industry we're involved in, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a way for people to look for another option to save their finances over time. It's for people who are disillusioned with the traditional financial system, who are disillusioned with the inflation caused by the Fed, and who are looking for alternatives. And they found that alternative in Bitcoin. And I think a lot of people are finding an alternative today in X, formerly known as Twitter. And then we had big news this last week with the Orange Man himself coming back to Twitter, Donald J. Trump, in a tweet reminiscent of Michael Jordan's simple two-word press release back in the early 90s after he went to baseball and then came back to the NBA. He had a just two-word press release that said, "I'm back." We saw something similar with Donald Trump just a couple days ago, where he had his first really substantive text tweet in a few years, where he asks, "Are you better off now than you were when I was president?" It is a very incisive question, because I think even if Democrats and people who are more liberal leaning were to answer that question honestly, they would have to admit that, yeah, they were better off, at least financially, in the vast majority of cases when Donald J. Trump was president. And so this tweet was linked to Trump's decision to do a sit-down interview with Elon Musk, the owner of X. This was a wide-ranging 2-hour interview that covered a number of policy areas. And immediately after the interview took place, here was the mainstream media's criticism of what happened during that interview. Do you mind pulling that graphic up, Dylan? It's there? Okay, great. So obviously the mainstream media absolutely hated this interview. I think it shows just how scared and threatened they feel by this emerging business model, where on X, you have a number of independent content creators who can seek out information for themselves. And that information is vetted not by fact checkers necessarily, but by a decentralized fact checking system known as community notes. So X engagement has increased significantly ever since Elon Musk bought it 2 years ago, ever since the mainstream media said that it was dead or dying and that wouldn't last the next year. So this interview really sent shockwaves across mainstream media, across X itself. Brian, did you get a chance to watch this interview, and what did you make of it? And what do you think the implications are for media going forward?
Yeah, I listened to almost all of it, to the vast majority of it. I thought it was incredibly interesting because they dove into so many important topics. The assassination attempt and the reforms the Secret Service can make in terms of how they cooperate with local law enforcement. They talked about the border. They talked about the economy. They talked about, they gave a master class on inflation and how it happens and what you need to do to correct it. It really was just an interesting conversation. A few of the media headlines, I was looking at that list, and a few, if you're making like a word bubble, a few of the things that jumped out at me, one, they were talking about the egos of the participants, as if a billionaire reality TV star and president and the world's richest man and most successful entrepreneur in history, as if that should come as a surprise that they have a little bit of ego. It's not like they talked about anything that seemed particularly egotistical, and not that caught my attention. So that's a weird angle to take. They attacked the effectiveness of X because not that X had problems, but that it was attacked, it was hacked. And that's why the conversation was delayed. But they seem to want to blame that on Elon and the platform. They referred to Trump as rambling. I mean, everybody knows his speaking style is unique. He is not a linear thinker. He, likes to jump around. So just pointing that out seems, I don't know, just an excuse to attack. But they didn't engage with the substance, at least not meaningfully. They chose to characterize rather than report. And so that is part of the reason for what we saw in the previous segment about the mainstream media's approval in the toilet, just down in the dumps, because they're not giving people facts to help them make better decisions. They're characterizing, they're campaigning, they're serving an agenda. So I thought the conversation was really a very interesting one, free flowing. I think Elon's goal, he said, was to let people sort of get a feel for what it's like to talk to Trump and get a feel for his thinking, rather than some kind of gotcha, interview to try to nail him down on particular positions or portray him in a bad light. Elon took the exact opposite approach of fact finding. So I guess my takeaway from this was, one, it was entertaining and interesting, and I think it was, sort of a public service. I think the Harris campaign, if they're up for it, should do more like that. Maybe they should engage with Elon, maybe find an audience or a platform that's not quite as friendly and let their candidate be tested a little bit. But I guess my kind of takeaway from that, Elon allowing President Trump to make his case, and in an unfiltered way, delivered to the whole world, anybody who wants to see it, that seems to exhibit more journalistic integrity from this billionaire entrepreneur than you see from a lot of media outlets. So hopefully a lot of people notice that, and hopefully that's part of their takeaway, and hopefully they think more critically about these issues, especially when they're reading accounts of them from the mainstream media outlets.
Yeah, I hope so as well. It reminded me of the interview that Donald Trump did with the All In podcast a couple months ago. I think that particular podcast episode really changed a lot of minds on who Donald Trump is. Donald Trump, when he's on the campaign trail giving his stump speeches, he definitely plays to his base there, to his audience. And he'll be a traveling comedian. He'll say funny things, sometimes outrageous things, but he'll mix in substance every now and then. But in the All In podcast, as well as during this interview with Elon Musk, there was plenty of substance there. Substance that, as you pointed out, Brian, the media refused to engage with whatsoever. It seems like the media is committed to keeping this a substance free election, an election focused solely on vibes, because they know that the leading candidate for the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, lacks all substance, but does have plenty of good vibes for people who have maybe shallower tasted vibes, shall we say. But I don't want to denigrate anybody there. But I will say that it was a very fascinating interview, 2 hours long. Just the stamina it takes for anyone of any age to interact on questions for that long of a period of time is pretty impressive. What I also found interesting was the relationship between Trump and Elon. They seem to be big fans of each other, and authentically so. I was surprised by how much respect Trump showed to Elon Musk. It seems like he genuinely loves the guy. And he even was open to the idea of Elon Musk heading some kind of commission to rein in government spending and eliminate government spending waste. So that was fascinating. And it would be one of the first times that Elon engages in a really meaningful way in American politics outside of donating to campaigns. And I think it raises an interesting question. We all know Elon Musk was born in South Africa, but since Elon really came into the cultural consciousness, there's been natural talk of him potentially running for president one day. Brian, what do you make of that idea? Elon Musk dipping his toes in politics and maybe even running for president one day. What is that even a possibility given the Constitution and how it's written? What are your thoughts on that idea?
Very, very interesting idea. On your first point that they seem to genuinely like each other. I mean, game respects game. But when it comes to President Trump, he loves talking to successful people. When I worked at the White House, he would frequently be in the residence calling some of the world's most successful businessmen, asking, "What do you think about this issue or that issue?" It's been sort of a hallmark of his career as a real estate developer, as a reality star. He loves to keep his finger on the pulse of not just the public and what they're talking about, but what the world's smartest, most successful people are thinking. And it's served him well, I think, to be open in that regard. They both have been Democrats in the past. Of course, the Clintons famously attended President Trump's wedding. Elon has described himself as a moderate Democrat in the past, now sort of changing over to the Republicans because of current conditions, and he's willing to adapt. I think that shows a sign of openness and maturity and forward thinking that I think more politicians would be wise to adopt. To your question of whether Elon could be president, I'll start with the short term and his suggestion of a commission to streamline the government, to make it more efficient, to reduce inflation, to reduce wasteful spending. Um, there have been commissions like that in the past, perhaps not with leaders as dynamic as Elon Musk. So maybe he would be more successful at that. He certainly was at Twitter. He laid off, what was it, 3/4 of the workforce, and Twitter is now more successful today. I think you could see, a dramatic downsizing of the government and have it serve the American public better. Having worked in the government, I have no doubt that is possible, and it would be good for the people. I will also echo Elon's mention of, when you start to attack the bureaucracy, you are attacking the matrix at that point, and there will be pushback. They will definitely fight back. You can't attack the swamp and not get bit by the gators. So it's a very difficult task, but somebody really needs to do it because our spending is out of control. Just debt service, defense, and entitlements alone, without the whole rest of the government, cost more than tax revenue for taking it. So we need a dramatic reduction in spending. They mentioned Javier Milei, the new president of Argentina, who did dramatic cutting in government spending, and they've seen their inflation get under control. So we have a real world model to look at that would be a good idea. It won't be easy to do, but it would be a good idea. Now, as to whether Elon could be the president, currently the president needs to be a natural born citizen, at least 35 years of age. He is not a natural born citizen. So I believe that it would require a constitutional amendment. That we've amended the Constitution in the past, obviously. Bill of Rights were the first 10 amendments. I believe we're at 27 amendments. So we've amended the Constitution lots of times in our history. You have to get state legislators to vote on it, or you can have, there's a few mechanisms to amend the Constitution. I'll have to refresh my memory on the different ways you can do it. There's been a push for a convention of the states, I know, to look at some additional constitutional amendments. If anybody could organize such an effort and fund such an effort, which would be tremendously expensive, it would be the world's wealthiest individual, the closest thing we have so far to a trillionaire. So, that would be very interesting. I think his talents perhaps will better serve the world staying in the business realm and supporting politicians who support innovation and economic growth and national security. I feel like, having been in the political world, the president of the United States has a lot of power, but so does the world's richest man and the world's most successful entrepreneur. So I think it's a matter of, probably the way he thinks about it is, how can I have the greatest impact? And I don't know that he's convinced that the greatest impact would be had in the political realm. Like I said, he used to be a moderate Democrat. Now he's supporting Trump. Maybe someday conditions change. He wants to switch back. Not to say you can't flip-flop again, but that alone could be a challenge in the political space. His candor on social media could be a bit of a political liability. I don't know. He may prefer to be talking to his audience of investors and Tesla owners and ex-users than wading into the very messy world of politics. I don't know. But at the very least, it would probably take a constitutional amendment, which would take up a tremendous amount of time and money and effort on his part, that I'm not sure he'd want to get away from his businesses that much to do it. So I'm skeptical of any Elon for president pushes. But who knows? Stranger things have happened. The host of The Apprentice got elected president. The greatest Twitter troll in the, if there were a Hall of Fame, he is in the WWE Hall of Fame. But perhaps the greatest reality star and Twitter troll and real estate developer got elected president. So stranger things have happened, but I am skeptical.
Yeah, well, and you make an interesting point too about attacking the matrix. When you're the president of the United States, whether you like it or not, you're very much in the matrix at that point. And there's a question of whether it's best to attack the matrix from the inside or from the outside. And it seems like Elon has been very effective at attacking it from the outside up to this point. And he's also had a really meaningful impact on people's lives working outside the organs of government. A really good example of that is Starlink. We've seen recently that the federal government has spent tens of billions of dollars to try to get broadband internet to rural America, whereas Elon Musk almost single-handedly has done that already through Starlink. Through Starlink, he's brought Wi-Fi to the world, and he didn't require any government apparatus or any taxpayer money to do that. And he's already promoting freedom in really meaningful ways outside of government. And he's arguably doing it much more effectively than he could inside of government. And, I've heard this idea floated that Elon's long-term plan is just to help everybody get off the grid. And he's doing that in a number of ways. Let's talk about Tesla for a second. Tesla is an electric vehicle company, but also a battery company. And they have batteries and solar panels through Tesla that you can effectively electrify your own home just through the solar panels alone. And then you don't need to connect to internet because you can connect to Starlink instead. So the idea here is you're getting off the grid completely by using Elon Musk products. So he's already promoting freedom, even as someone who isn't a politician of any kind. So whether he runs for president one day or not, whether the Constitution is amended to make that possible, who knows? I don't think it's necessary for him to have a really positive impact on people's lives. But it'll be interesting to see going forward. So
yeah, I want to expand on that just a little bit because you made a great point. So Starlink made available to people around the world more effectively than any government could. The U.S. government had made a contract with Starlink and ended up abandoning it because the government processes got in the way. Tesla, he has millions of electric car owners all over the world. The U.S. government tried to be helpful by spending billions of dollars on charging stations. That has been a colossal flop. Nonetheless, a lot of additional people have been buying Teslas. I'd add in SpaceX, which I think he's advanced the potential for space travel much faster than even NASA. So he hasn't needed the government to make these world-changing advancements. So why would he put the shackles of government on himself when he's already doing things that are viewed as sort of public functions requiring public support? He's doing them without it, and he's doing it better. So I think that's just another data point to add to show that maybe his talents are not as would not be used as efficiently or as effectively in the political realm, but that he'll do more good from the business realm. Politics flows downhill from culture, and Elon is helping to create a culture of efficiency and effectiveness in all these different business lines. I just don't think he needs government to continue advancing humanity.
Agreed. If anything, I think he needs government to simply get out of his way at this point. Tesla and Starlink are helping people get off the grid. And as you point out, SpaceX will one day help people get off the planet. So he is promoting a lot of technologies that are expanding freedom on a scale we've never seen before. And he's doing it all outside of the apparatus of government. That's huge. So, Brian, we were going to talk originally about Tim Walz and whether he's a boon or a burden, but just being mindful of our time today, I think we'll move on to talking about Kamala Harris's crypto reset. We touched on this briefly last week. We've seen reports that the Kamala Harris campaign is interested in remaking their relationship with crypto. Of course, this relationship is incredibly strained given the Biden administration's approach to crypto, where, among other things, they've tried to impose a 30% excise tax on Bitcoin miners. They've sued multiple crypto companies. There's been political prosecution from their allies in the Senate, most prominently with Elizabeth Warren, who's mounted an anti-crypto army to go after the industry. There's a lot of work to do if they really want to reset things with the digital asset space. What was really disappointing this last week, and you touched on this a little bit in our last episode, we were concerned that a lot of what Kamala Harris has said about crypto, or at least her campaign has said about crypto up to this point, has been simply lip service and not much other than that. And there's actually a lot of evidence that you were exactly right. So Alex Thorne, who is a real thought leader in the industry, would you mind pulling up that tweet, Dylan? He did some investigative work here about two of the key architects behind Kamala Harris's economic agenda. I want to bring up two names, Brian Deese and Bharat Ramamurthy. So let's talk about Deese first. Deese is one of the architects of Operation Choke Point 2.0. Operation Choke Point 2.0, for those who don't know, was the coordinated campaign amongst executive agencies and certain members of Congress to try to more or less kill the crypto industry by going after banking. Banks that provided any financial services to crypto companies experienced a regulatory attack unlike anything we've ever seen, and tried to more or less choke off the industry from its lifeblood, which is money. And so that was really troubling. But Brian Deese is apparently one of the architects of this campaign. And then worst of all, you have Ramamurthy. And so who is Ramamurthy? Do you mind pulling up the other link, Dylan? Ramamurthy, for those who don't know, was arguably the foremost critic of crypto in the White House. He worked on the National Economic Council and apparently he is now advising Donald or Kamala Trump on crypto issues, on economic issues more broadly. So it's just a mess. Brian, given this new information, what do you make of the current state of Kamala's crypto reset? Should the industry even play ball at this point, or are we just engaging in a humiliation ritual?
Well, it's a great question. It is unfortunate to see that. I'll add a few more policy points. The administration, choke point 2.0, as you point out, the banking regulators basically told banks, not through regulation, not through notice and comment, not through any kind of public process, but sort of regulation by press release and conversations behind closed doors. They're telling banks that any digital asset company could pose risks to the safety and soundness of the banking system, basically with a wink and a nod, telling the large financial institutions, don't do business with digital asset companies. It was, I believe, an unconstitutional continuation of Operation Choke Point 1.0, where they targeted other types of businesses that administration didn't like. At that time, it was the Obama administration, and they didn't like firearm manufacturers or payday lenders. There was a lot of activity amongst some of the Democrat members on the Hill and the administration against oil and gas companies, which they don't like. Then 2.0 in the Biden administration targeted digital asset companies. So they tried to take away our bank accounts. There were banks saying, we can't do business with you, even if it were just having a checking account to run payroll, basically a no risk proposition. And they were refusing to do it because the regulators in this administration were cracking down. If they really wanted a reset, then they would not be hiring the architects of such a plan. They would be publicly repudiating it. It's hard for Harris to do that when she's the vice president of this administration. Further actions in some of the documents produced by these individuals you're highlighting, statements from the White House, were praising Operation Choke Point. Of course, not calling it that, but framing it in altruistic terms. They also were encouraging the Energy Department and the EPA to look at Bitcoin mining to effectively limit or eliminate Bitcoin mining in the US by making it impossible for these companies to acquire the energy, the electricity they need to run their businesses. You mentioned the SEC's hostility, the regulators, suing various companies, sort of making up rules as they went along, refusing to provide any clarity. It's been a real disaster for the industry. This is highly publicized. There's now PACs out there. We're running the Bitcoin Voter Project. Of course, Fair Shake with Coinbase, Andreessen Horowitz, other large firms are getting involved in races now to try to make sure that the policymakers in the future are not going to be so hostile. So there seems to be a changing of the tide in public opinion and amongst the industry to really request more clarity to allow the industry to succeed in the U.S. Meanwhile, the Harris campaign is bringing back the very architects of the policies that have been so discriminatory against the industry. It's really hard to take this quote unquote reset seriously when they're doubling down on the bad policies that have led to voters and campaign funds going against them. So it's really disheartening to see this, talking out of both sides of their mouths, claiming there may be a reset while hiring the very people who organized the crackdown. I think crackdown is too kind a term. I think it's discriminatory policies against businesses they don't like. That is small d democratic. It is bad for business. It's bad for the United States. It's bad for our ability to lead in terms of innovation in the future. So it's very hard to trust them. Now, there's going to be a conversation, I understand, crypto for Harris. There are some high-profile Democrats trying to encourage this reset. Congressman Ro Khanna, with whom we've met, is supportive of the industry. Congressman Wiley Nickel is supportive. Mark Cuban and Scaramucci coming out saying they need to reset things. They need to abandon the Elizabeth Warren approach, the Gary Gensler approach, and they need to adopt a more tech-friendly attitude if they want the U.S. to lead. It seems to be a bit of wish casting. Now, I guess that this Crypto for Harris event, supposedly they're going to have Senator Chuck Schumer speaking and talking about how he wants the industry to have fair rules in the US. But Chuck Schumer is not running for president. He may be a leader in the Senate, but the administrative state has been the biggest challenge for the industry. So again, the hiring of these policy advisors who orchestrated the attacks against the industry indicates that any kind of reset is just very difficult to take seriously.
Agreed, 100%. What we're seeing, I think, in the Kamala Harris campaign is a real discrepancy between supposed policy goals and personnel. She keeps running away from her current record as vice president and as a member of the Biden administration by saying that she'll be tougher on the border, she'll be tougher on crime, she'll be softer towards crypto. In other words, she'll do all these things that she and Joe Biden haven't been doing for the past 4 years. And all that we've seen so far are what appear to be hollow promises that she's going to change course. And we have very little reason up to this point to trust that she means what she's saying. So it's really frustrating, really disappointing, but there's always hope there. And we're always willing to entertain those who want to make good with our industry, because we believe that this industry really is the path forward for freedom and innovation in the United States. So we've covered a lot of topics this week, Brian, but I also know there's a lot to cover in the Texas political and energy scene, and that you had a really interesting event this week with Senator Cruz. Do you want to touch on some of those issues in our last segment here?
Sure. So one of the main drivers of innovation in the US is going to be energy dominance. We need a lot more electricity to power the economy of the future. And President Trump even touched on this in his speech at Bitcoin Nashville. So Dylan, can we pull up the clip from his speech there?
But we will be creating so much electricity that you'll be saying, please, please, President, we don't want any more electricity. We can't stand it. You'll be begging me, no more electricity, sir. We have enough.
No more electricity, sir. We have enough.
Please, sir. So he talks about it in a very funny way, but it is a deadly serious issue. Glad to see him talking about it. We need more power. AI, for Bitcoin mining, for any number of industries. And Senator Cruz had an event this week where the Texas Blockchain Council, where I'm involved, decided to make an endorsement in that race, and they endorsed Senator Cruz. And he talked about how Bitcoin mining can be really helpful for creating more resilient and robust energy grids. So can we pull up that clip real quick, Dylan?
Well, God bless Texas, and God bless Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a reservoir of power, a safety blanket for the state of Texas.
As we stand on the cusp of a new era of financial innovation, it's crucial that we have leaders who understand the importance of maintaining an environment where innovation can prosper, free from unnecessary government intervention. It is because of Senator Cruz's leadership that the Texas Blockchain Council has decided to endorse Senator Cruz in his upcoming race for re-election.
I am proud to stand with the Texas Blockchain Council. I'm proud to stand with Bitcoin miners and all of crypto in the state of Texas.
This was a really important event because the Texas energy grid is always in the news. They need more power in Texas because it's a growing state for business, for people moving there. And what he was pointing out is that Bitcoin miners can be really helpful for stabilizing the energy grid. They will buy power off peak when others won't necessarily use it, which is helpful for generators of energy. It helps them plan, and it helps them make the economics work for new energy development. And simultaneously, because Bitcoin miners are flexible, they can make power available at peak demand so that consumers don't experience disruptions, especially important in Texas. If you have 115-degree heat, everybody needs their air conditioning. That means you're going to have very high demand. So Bitcoin miners help develop the power that the state needs, and then they can give it back when it's necessary. That's the flexible load. Bitcoin network. It's decentralized. So critically important point there from Senator Cruz. Very wise of the Texas Blockchain Council to endorse him because he is one of the few policymakers that understands this. And we need more voices like that. In the Senate, I hope there's Republicans and Democrats who start to adopt his positions. While we do need a ton of electricity, President Trump is right. We also don't want to be Chicken Little and act like the sky is falling. So there's one other piece of optimistic information I just wanted to make people aware of. Dylan, I don't know if you have my tweet that I had posted on this issue, but if you have that, you could throw it up. There you go. So there was an estimate that because of all this tech growth in Texas, they were going to increase their peak demand from 85 gigawatts to 150 gigawatts just by the end of the decade. This would be basically meeting the growth that has happened over the past 100 years in the next 6 years. Well, it's not that dramatic. It's really not. So there have been some researchers at Inveris and the University of Texas at Austin who have looked at this, and they found that that estimate is dramatically overblown. And it is, because the interconnect queue, number one, is overestimated because people test speculative or aspirational projects that might not necessarily come to fruition. And in fact, Inveris estimates that the real demand between now and the end of the decade is probably closer to 93.5 gigawatts. That's a 10% increase as opposed to a 76% increase. So we do need more power, but we don't need to act like the sky is falling. That's a critically important point. The other one I would reiterate is with Bitcoin mining, you have a flexible load that's going to help develop new energy and then help stabilize the grid by being able to toggle up and down when you hit peak demand. So a lot of reason for optimism. We need more electricity for the economy of the future. President Trump is right. I hope indeed very soon we are begging him for no more electricity. We have too much electricity. I don't think that'll happen because becoming energy dominant really is necessary for the future. But you know, we need to be responsible. We need to develop more energy, but we don't need to freak out. There are almost 400 gigawatts of power development in the interconnect queue. Even if you accept the really high estimate of demand at 150 gigawatts, the generation side of the queue dwarfs the demand side. So that's again why Bitcoin miners are important, because you can monetize that off-peak energy, make sure that the economics are going to work for new power projects, and that'll help Texas to be stronger in the future. And really, it can be a model for all of America. So very important issue. Energy is going to be, I think, certainly a top 10 issue, maybe higher than that in this campaign. And I'm very glad to see at least President Trump and Senator Cruz talking about it, and hopefully urging policymakers to make good decisions, sound decisions based on accurate information and not inaccurate information. You can't be rationing electricity, deciding who gets it and who doesn't. That's not the way to go. We need that abundance mindset of there will be plenty of power for everybody. We can do it, but we have to do it based on real facts and information, not speculation or just hair on fire breakdowns. So very exciting event this week with Senator Cruz, following the very exciting events with President Trump. I hope the Harris campaign is paying attention. Come on in, the water is warm. We need more power, and we need our government to allow that power to be built. So good facts coming out this week. Wanted to make sure we share that.
Yeah, that's really good stuff, and important too, because there's so many misconceptions about Bitcoin's impact on the grid, especially in Texas. And so the fact that we have Senator Cruz out there clearing up a lot of those misconceptions is critical to policymaking within the state. So I'm really glad he was there doing that. And Brian, you know, something we've touched on a lot on this podcast is what you mentioned, the energy abundance versus the energy scarcity mindset. I think Trump has really found a political winner in hitting on the theme of energy over and over again. Please, Mr. President, no more electricity. It's such a winner because energy is the base layer of our economy. It's what powers AI innovation. It's what powers transportation. It's what powers really all of our electronic services across an economy that is more and more digital every day. And the fact that you have some policymakers out there who are actually arguing that we should decrease our energy usage, or that we should scale it back, or we should switch over to energy sources that are intermittent and much less reliable is insanity, because you're just making less firm what is the base layer of our economy. And so this all hands on deck approach to expanding our energy capacity, I think, will not only benefit our economy, but something you've mentioned too in the past, it will bring down inflation too. High energy prices are one of the core causes of high inflation today. And if we can make energy cheaper for all Americans, we can also curb inflation, which affects everybody indiscriminately. So I think he's found a real political winner there, talking about energy as much as he has.
Hugely important point. So when did we see inflation start to spike? There are a few factors. One, or the two most important ones perhaps, were one, government spending and printing trillions of dollars, even after COVID, when we should have been reducing those emergency levels of spending. There were additional spending bills passed that devalued the dollar, created rampant inflation. The other piece was Russia invaded Ukraine, energy prices spiked, and when energy prices spiked, consumer prices spiked. So you bring down the cost of energy, you bring down the cost of everything, because energy, like you said, is the base layer for pretty much our whole economy. And we just had a real-time lesson in that. So I hope policymakers take away that we should have abundant power, not just for the United States. We should be exporting LNG again in a robust way to Western Europe. That will strengthen our allies. It will weaken our adversaries like Russia, and it will make the American economy much stronger and more resilient. So hugely important issue. Glad we got to touch on that.
Same. And I think we've covered a lot of topics today, and that probably closes things out. Anything else we want to touch on before we close today?
Just to tell everybody to like and subscribe. Follow us on X at Morgan Stern NJ, at Sam Lyman 33. Send us a note. If you liked what you heard, or you have questions, or you didn't like what you hear, send us a note. We're glad that you've joined us on this very robust podcast today. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll see you next time.